Thank you for joining us and welcome to the first of our conversations on Europe this academic year. My name is Ron Linden. I'm director of the European Union Center of Excellence and the European Studies Center. This is the third year we have done these interactive video conferences, and believe it or not, it's the fourth time we have focused on Germany in those conversations, focusing on Germany in the EU, on Angela Merkel. One of them took place in German. And we have done them on a variety of topics, and we'll do so in the course of the year. I would like to begin by thanking the staff of the European Union Center, Alison Delnor, Kate Lewis, and Eleni Valiant, who make this possible. I want to be sure and thank Mark Weitzel, our technology person, and I certainly want to thank the director of EUCE, Larry Fike, who is here, whose initiative and farsightedness brought us this wonderful technology, which we are using in this room and, believe it or not, in an overflow room. I want to thank our partners for this conversation who are joining us, other EU centers around the country, Wisconsin, Texas, University of Texas, University of North Carolina, Illinois, and the University of Miami. And I certainly want to thank the World Affairs Council, our partner in this event and in many other events. Before I introduce today's moderator, I want to mention our next event, which will be Thursday, October 3rd, a week from this Thursday, in this room. Dr. Carolyn Band, former Dean of ISBIA, former Director of the European Union Center, who has completed a book on the integration of staff from East Europe in the EU, called Management and Culture in an Enlarged Commission, Unity in Diversity. And she will give a talk. The next day, we will be, courtesy of the World Affairs Council, happy to host Eric Wirtz from the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, offering a talk on, actually, it will be an informal discussion to which you are invited, Germany, Spain, and the Euro crisis. And if you are interested, and let me apply the crucial variable, there will be lunch. Please contact Alison, and we will be happy to include you. Our next conversation will be in this room on October 22nd, and it will be on the subject: Does Turkey have a future in Europe? It will be here. We will have again a panel of people devoted to talking about that subject. Today we will address the recent German elections and the implications thereof, and we are very fortunate to have acting as a moderator today Dr. Stephen Sokol, who is President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. He has been in this position since 2010 and previously held the title of Vice President and Director of Programs of the American Council on Germany, and prior to that was the Deputy Director of the Aspen Institute in Berlin. He holds a PhD in Law and Public Policy from Northeastern University and an MA from SAIS, as well as a BA from Wesleyan University. He is a huge Germanophile, and I must say a Pittophile, which we're happy about. And he will introduce our panelists. I do want to say two things, however, before I turn it over to Steve. One, this conversation is being recorded. Through the wonders of technology, we will be able to not only record, but then post this entire conversation on our website very soon. The second is my own personal apology. I have to leave before we're done. We're scheduled to run till 1:30, but I teach at 1 o'clock, and I know my students would miss me if I didn't show up. So I will have to leave early. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Steve.
Thank you, Ron. Welcome to everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today and to have been entrusted with the role of navigating 6 speakers and five video conference sites today. I think we have a lot of people who are going to have some interesting things to say and a lot of opportunity to have a great discussion. As Ron indicated, I am a big fan of Germany. I've spent a lot of time in Germany, altogether about 12 years. And in my current job, I don't have as many opportunities to talk about Germany or focus on Germany. So thank you for the opportunity to do that today. Let me start by introducing our panelists. To my immediate left is Patrick Altdorfer. He is with the Political Science Department here at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'll do more of an introduction of you when I tee up your question. Let's go to UT Texas, where we actually have 3 speakers sitting around a table. We have David Prue, who's in the history department. Can you wave so that everybody knows who you are? There in the middle, that's David. And Peter Rehberg, who's in the Department of Germanic Studies. And Per Urlaub, who's also in the Department of Germanic Studies. Thanks to all 3 of you for being there for us. And then at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Myra, Marx, Ferree. Myra, can you wave to everybody so that they know where you are? Yes, super. And Nils, Ringe, who's with the Political Science Department there as well.
And a Pitt PhD.
So all of you are going to be involved in the discussion today, and what I thought I would do, actually in the interest of full disclosure, what I did is I reached out to all the panelists and asked them to send me some questions that they would like to have asked, and I've taken those questions and sort of molded them into a little bit of a roadmap for our discussions today. I don't know that I've covered all the questions that they put out there, but I have to admit, the questions, most of them came to me before the election, so they were very hypothetical. I probably should have asked after the election, what would they like to be asked about? And then we'll definitely have ample time for the panelists to talk amongst themselves, but also to field questions from all of you at the different sites. Almost exactly a week ago, I was asked to give a talk about the German election. So the pre-election talk. What do we expect? What do we think is going to happen? And I got in touch with some of my friends in Germany, some of my contacts in Berlin, and it was very interesting. There was a lot of hand-wringing across Berlin. And I mean literally across East and West Berlin, but also across the political parties, across the spectrum. Because nobody really knew exactly how this election was going to pan out. I think there was very little doubt in most people's minds that Angela Merkel would be elected for a 3rd term in office. But the question was really, how is that going to manifest itself in Parliament, and who is she going to be governing with? We have some of those answers now, but just as a quick reminder, let me run through a couple of things. Merkel's party received 41.5% of the vote. That is a far bigger share than it received in 2005 when it won just over 35% of the vote, and a significantly larger amount than it won in 2009 with almost 34% of the vote. So the CDU and CSU really did exceptionally well, basically the best results in 2 decades, if you will, and just short of an absolute majority in the Bundestag, albeit it would have been a pretty weak absolute majority had they won it, but they're literally less than a dozen seats away from an absolute, or about a dozen seats away from an absolute majority. I think it's fairly safe to say that the CDU and Merkel won largely because of her popularity, but that's something that I think will be up for discussion during the course of our conversation today. And now, the tedious task looms of having to build a coalition government. The past coalition party, the Free Democrats, did not make the 5% hurdle, so they are not represented and are not a possibility as a coalition partner. The Social Democrats had said in the run-up to the election that they would not partner with the Christian Democrats, that they would not form a grand coalition. But given the opportunity to govern again, it's highly likely that we will see a grand coalition, because this is going to be a hard thing for the SPD to pass up. And something that we'll talk about today is whether or not a grand coalition is a good thing or a bad thing. There is a precedent. There was one in the 1960s, but that was fairly short-lived. But from 2005 to 2009, of course, there was a grand coalition, and it was actually quite stable. It ran the full term, which surprised some analysts at the beginning. That's largely, I think, thanks to the coalition agreement, which was signed and put into place, but it took a very long time to negotiate that coalition agreement, and it will be interesting to see how long it takes this time around. Before turning to the big parties, the CDU and the Social Democrats, though, I'd like to focus our conversation by talking about some of the small parties, some of the splinter parties and the role that they've played, because the Free Democrats, the Linkspartei, the Left Party, the Green Party, all saw their numbers drop. And as a matter of fact, the Greens suffered such a big loss that their leadership resigned Monday, as did the leader of the Free Democratic Party, the Alternative for Germany Party, the anti-Euro protest party didn't make it into the parliament as well. Their support evaporated. So I think that this sort of party politics is something that's very, very interesting to watch. So I'd like to begin by going to the University of Wisconsin and to Myra in the Department of Sociology. She's the Alice H. Cook Professor of Sociology and directs the European Union Center of Excellence at the University of Wisconsin. She has spent significant amounts of time in Germany. She was a Berlin Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin in 2005, and in 2004 she was a visiting professor at the Ruhr University in Bochum. And she's written extensively about gender issues, which during the course of our discussion is something we'll get into. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the small parties and the fact that they did not do very well in the election at all. This is particularly true of the Green Party, of the Left Party, and yet there were not really significant gains on the part of the Social Democrats as a result of the Greens and the Left Party having done fairly poorly. So Myra, I guess my question to you is, to what degree do you think the Social Democrats are a credible alternative for some of the smaller parties in the left spectrum of the landscape in Germany?
In the sense of working with the SPD, I think it's always somewhat tense because they form their identity as much by being oppositional to the SPD and trying to provide some kind of alternative other than the SPD's version of a left alternative. So in some ways, they're at least as hostile to working with the SPD as they are to working with the CDU. That doesn't mean there haven't been very productive and useful coalitions at the state level, but I think it's there's been some discussion, which I would put in the category of fantasy, about a left coalition that somehow or another all of the left parties could themselves provide an alternative to the CDU and govern from the left. And well, I think that would be very nice. I think that that is a kind of left fantasy. And it's much more likely that Merkel, being a clever and incremental kind of politician, will initiate discussions of some sort with both the SPD and the Greens in ways to make the SPD nervous about their possibilities of that it's not a foregone conclusion that they would have to be the partner and it would have to be a grand coalition. And at the same time, to be talking very seriously with the SPD in ways that make the Greens a little nervous about what is their position on the outside here. Are they going to have any influence on things that matter to them much more than they matter to the SPD, like getting out of the nuclear energy business, and where Merkel has really moved very much in their direction. Obviously, there are huge, huge, huge differences between the Greens and the CDU, but there was also a Greens Realo type of green politician saying, well, you know, the FDP has really blown it with their emphasis on liberalism as markets. We have, in some sense, the responsibility of carrying a political liberalism focused on rights and individuals and opportunities that are more anti-discriminatory into the discussion. I don't know whether that's at all realistic. I would also tend to put that in the fantasy category, but I do think that Merkel is smart enough to exploit the discussion and move back and forth between talking to the Greens and the SPD, because she doesn't really need very many votes. And that puts her in a very powerful position.
And that, I think, is one of the factors right now that, in a sense, Merkel is in a much stronger position to negotiate this coalition agreement than she was in 2005, simply because her party's done so well.
On the other hand, if you look at it from the Greens' perspective, the SPD went into a coalition with Merkel and it pretty much destroyed them. The FDP went into a coalition with Merkel and it pretty much destroyed them. The incentive for the Greens to take a chance and work with Merkel, I think the incentive structure isn't there to entice them in unless they were given an enormous amount. And I don't think Merkel's prepared to do that, though I think she's prepared to talk about what she might do, in part to get the SPD to play ball.
So let's continue in the same vein and talk a little bit more about some of these small parties and bring it back to Pittsburgh and to Patrick Altdorfer here at the University of Pittsburgh. Patrick teaches in the political science department, has his PhD from Pitt, and has done significant work on the East German identity and East German culture. And I guess I'd like to talk to you a little bit about sort of the role of some of these smaller parties, whether you were surprised at how poorly they fared, both East and West, and then maybe get some of your analysis of the left party, the Linkspartei, and its role in the East and the West as well.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for inviting me. I guess in some respects, if you're paying, reading up on the polling leading up to the Bundestag election, you saw that the weakness of the FDP, the Liberals were teetering on that 5% hurdle. So I wouldn't say that necessarily I was surprised that they didn't make it into the parliament, but since the election, I've had a chance to sort of look over the results and just the depth of their weakness in the East really does stun me on closer reflection here. They have become, in the way I think about the FDP, is they've become a party of the 1%, and that's the 1% of West Germans. They are really in very deep trouble. Obviously, their best result at the county level or the constituency level was 9.2%, and that was in the West. I checked to see how they did state by state, and every West German state they achieved 5%. In the East, they only made it in amongst Berlin voters, and the other 6 states, or the other 5 states, they didn't make it in. They came close in Brandenburg and Thuringia, but that was essentially really embarrassing for them. I mean, the fact that their support just completely collapsed, obviously, as you pointed out, led to the resignation of their leaders. The left party, by contrast, I'm sorry, let me say something about the Green Party as well. The Green Party, very similarly, has become a party of the West. They made it into, they reached the 5% only in Berlin on the strength of their support in the western districts of Berlin, and they made it into they reached the 5% hurdle in all the West German states, but it was pretty narrow in some of those places. The left party, by contrast, the other small party that you mentioned, this has become really an East German regional party. This confirms some research that I did a few years back now, going back longer than I'd care to admit. But in some respects, they have proved themselves to be expanding the scope of their support to become somewhat more of a left-wing populist party. And this has to do with their expansion to attract voters from the left wing of the SPD, voters who had been frustrated with the more centrist course that the SPD took under the Schroeder government, the reform agenda 2010, and so on. So what you've seen is a party that's reached a low of 2.6% support and a high of 34.6% on the constituency level. And you can see that if you happen to watch the election night coverage when Gregor Gysi, who is party leader, gave his statement about the election results. It was kind of interesting that he pointed out that who could have said 20 years ago, or in 1990, that this party could be the third strongest party in the Federal Republic. And I had to catch my breath when I heard him say that because, obviously the results don't seem to bear that out. But he was essentially taking the union parties and pointing out that they did better than the CSU did nationwide. So maybe we can talk a little bit about particularities of that later. But as far as the Alternative for Germany party, the right-wing populist party, a Eurosceptic party, it's in some respects I thought that they were going to get in, and that in itself surprised me because this is a party that had only been created in April this year. So for a party to be created sort of out of whole cloth, but appealing to that Eurosceptic, anti-Euro, anti-EU sentiment, that's I think that the fact that they wound up with, was it 4.8%, I believe it was, 4.7%.
4.7 is what I saw.
Yeah, I looked at that also by region. They wound up in the West with 4.4% of the vote, with 5.8% in the East. So I'm not sure that I would write them off yet. But on the other hand, we've also had some experience with right-wing populist parties in Germany. The Schill Party, for instance, or there was the Instead Party, the Stadtpartei, a few years back as well. And there have been also several right-wing, very extremist parties of the nationalist fringe that rarely jump above the 5% hurdle at the state level and have never done it at the national level. So the strength of these parties and the smaller parties in the East also tells you something about the lack of party binding and party association, party affiliation in that region. And I think that also can be traced back to the legacy of 40 years of communism and their relatively younger experience now with democracy.
So as a follow-up to that, the Free Democratic Party has long been considered the kingmaker, and certainly has made a number of coalition governments. They did exceptionally well in the election 4 years ago, had a precipitous drop, losing nearly 10% of the electorate this time around. It was clear from polling that they were not going to do well. But were you surprised that they did not even make it beyond the 5%?
I was somewhat surprised by that. I thought they would eke out the 5.1%, and make it in. In the past, they had done fairly well. When it looked like they were going to be booted out, they could usually rely on some of the the ticket splitting behavior of the union voters. particularly West German voters, West German supporters of the CDU and CSU, if they saw that the union might not have a reliable centrist coalition partner, they would donate their second vote, that party vote, to the FDP, and then use their first vote, their constituency vote, to vote for a CDU or CSU member of parliament directly. And in this case, that didn't happen. In 2009, the FDP, on the strength largely, I think, of the ticket splitting, came up with a result of 14+%. And this time, they were under 5%. So it appears that that great result they reached 4 years ago may have been largely built upon the backs of these ticket splitting behavior.
So let's keep with the assessment of the parties and go to the University of Wisconsin and to Nils Ringe. He is an associate professor of political science, and his research and teaching interests focus on European Union politics, particularly party politics, social networks, and also elections. I was actually in Berlin 4 years ago for the election, sort of 3 days ahead of the election, 3 days after the election, and had the opportunity to talk with some of the senior leaders in the Social Democratic Party after the election, and they felt just completely obliterated with their 23% of the vote. And one of them said, we have no hope of being a governing party on a national level again in 4 years. The earliest we're looking at is 8, maybe 12 years from now. So my question to you, Nils, is given the election results that we've had, given how you've followed parties and particularly looked at the landscape in Germany, what do you think the future holds for the Social Democratic Party?
Well, it does seem that the only way that they can be in office at this point in time is by coalescing with the CDU. It is as long as the Social Democrats rule out the possibility. Do I need to speak up? Yeah. Okay, so as long as the Social Democrats rule out the possibility of forming a federal level coalition with the left party, there seems to be very little hope for them to actually gain a majority large enough with only the Greens to be able to rule at the national level. The strategy so far has been to allow for regional alliances with the left party, but to rule out any kind of formal cooperation at the federal level, basically arguing that the left party is not ready or not mature enough to act as a responsible government party. I suspect that eventually there's going to have to be a little bit of a shift in the leadership's assessment of this, because as this election has made quite clear, again, right, Greens and SPD is not going to be strong enough to actually gain an absolute majority of seats in the Bundestag. So I would imagine that eventually we're going to see a greater willingness on the part of the SPD to actually consider seriously, or at least not rule out a priori, cooperation with the left party. And I think at that point in time, and I'm not entirely sure when that's going to happen, I think it's probably a little bit further off than, say, the next election, maybe the one after that. I'm not sure, but I think eventually the SPD is going to be able to reap some of the benefits of this strategy of allowing for regional alliances while ruling out cooperation nationally, by being able to point at successful cooperation at the regional level, basically arguing that these alliances have shown that the left party is in fact mature enough to now be considered a possible coalition partner at the federal level as well. So there's a little bit of speculation now, and this is something that I don't think is actually entirely realistic. But some commentators have indicated that perhaps the SPD is going to be willing to go into a coalition with the CDU, but basically with the intention of leaving the coalition at the first opportunity. Germany, of course, only allows for a constructive parliamentary vote of no confidence, meaning that a successor has to be elected in order for the current chancellor to be sacked. And so the idea would be that once an opportunity presents itself, the deputies of SPD, Left Party, and Greens would elect either Sigmar Gabriel, the current leader of the SPD, or perhaps somebody like Hannelore Kraft, the Prime Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia, the most populous German state, as the new chancellor. I would imagine that this is a unrealistic scenario at this point in time. But I could certainly imagine that if the SPD ends up being hurt in the polls in a way that is similar to what they experienced between 2005 and 2009, that perhaps a willingness to consider this as a scenario might increase. I don't think it's going to happen at the first opportunity, but I think there's certainly a possibility that this coalition might not make it throughout the entire term. There's perhaps one thing that I would like to add to the question of the alternative for Germany and its staying power. I wasn't necessarily surprised that they didn't win 5%. That seems to be what the poll suggested before the election. But in terms of their staying power, I think there's two things to consider. One is how they manage this potential threat of being perceived as a far-right party, which at least according to their current leadership, they don't want to be. So they want to be an alternative to the kind of current pro-European consensus on the part of the other parties. So, but of course, they have been facing, people joining the party who were clearly of a far-right sentiment, and how they deal with that, I think, is going to be one of the determining factors for how they might end up doing. Because I don't think a far-right party, I don't think running as a far-right party is a necessarily promising electoral strategy in Germany. However, one thing to also keep in mind in terms of their future performance is that the next big election that's going to matter for them is an European Parliament election in 2014. And so at that point, the question is not going to be a 5% hurdle, and it is going to be much more, revolving around what is their core issue. And I suspect that the alternative for Germany, especially in the second-order elections, or the second-orderedness that characterize EP elections, I suspect that the alternative for Germany is going to do quite well.
So it's certainly a party to watch.
Yes.
Nils. And maybe as a follow-up, I want to come back to something. There were a lot of people who were very skeptical about the last Grand Coalition before it was launched, and said that they questioned whether it would run the full 4 years. From what you indicated, some of the doubts that you have, can you talk a little bit about why you think that why it's not a given that this will be a lasting coalition?
Well, I mean, the problem for the SPD last time around was that they were quite clearly perceived as a junior partner, and they, being in a government with Merkel did not allow them to actually, pursue a, setting a profile for themselves that would appeal to a broad enough electoral base to actually be an alternative to the CDU next time around. The SPD is caught in this unfortunate position from its own perspective of having to appeal on the one hand to a set of constituents to their left, where they are now competing with the Green Party as well as with the Left Party. But at the same time, of course, the SPD still sees itself as a Volkspartei, as a people's party that represents a large chunk of Germany's electorate, and if it wants to win, anywhere around the 30% mark, which might be about as good as it gets for the SPD these days, they're also going to have to be appealing to the central, to more of a centrist voter, and that has been proving to be very difficult for the SPD to do that simultaneously. So I think that the danger for them is, once again, that being in government with Merkel is not going to allow them to actually build up a profile that is perceived by enough German voters as independent enough to actually be considered an alternative, especially as long as Merkel is as popular as she is now. And so at some point in time, there could be a strategic decision to say, okay, this is really not going to work for us either in the short term or looking ahead at the next couple of elections, and we're going to have to do something drastically different. Again, I'm not convinced that that's going to happen. I think it's probably not the more likely scenario, but I don't think it's outside the realm of the possible if the SPD starts being concerned about, experiencing kind of deja vu for the 2005 to 2009 period.
Thank you. So before going on to our next speaker and to UT Austin, if you want to tweet about this, or if you want to tweet a question to us, please use the hashtag PITTCOE. And I'll get those questions and be able to feed that into the conversation that we have. So I'd like to go to UT Austin and to Peter Rehberg. He's in the Department of Germanic Studies. He's been at UT Austin since 2011. Prior to that, he was at Cornell, Northwestern, Brown, the University of Bonn, and he has his PhD from NYU. But he also worked as a journalist for a number of years and has interviewed a number of people, past and present, who have played an important role in German politics. And I guess I'd like to start our part of the conversation by asking you about Merkel. We haven't really talked about Merkel yet in this conversation. How do you think her rhetoric, her governance style has shaped political culture in Germany?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that always seems striking to me is that Merkel is rhetorically, she has relatively poor skills. You know, even in a TV debate with Per Steinbrück prior to the elections, where she has nothing really to fear, right? I mean, the polls demonstrated her popularity. She seems tired. She's not engaged. She has no charisma. You know, there's hardly a moment, like even with a Neujahrsansprache or in debates in the parliament, where Merkel is a convincing speaker. However, this flaw, let's say, in style seems to work in her advantage. And that's a curious thing. So it's not being criticized. People from the opposition don't really take advantage of that. It seems to be that it comes across as a certain kind of Volkstümlichkeit, as her being one of the people, as non-threatening. So I would say we have a paradox here. She lacks certain skills. For instance, Per Steinbrück is a much better speaker. He's much wittier, he's faster than she is, but he cannot use that against her. That's a very curious effect for me. So there's a certain averageness in character and style with Merkel that certainly is in a way also reminiscent of Helmut Kohl's style of Volkstümlichkeit. And you know, remember in the 80s or early 90s, leftist or liberal media would always make fun of Kohl and his lack of sophistication, etc., etc. And we had the same effect. This would rather increase his popularity than somehow hurting him. However, with Merkel, I would say it's not just, let's say, a question of style. I mean, she did make a couple of serious mistakes. Remember, for instance, the thing about the Minister of Defense Gutenberg, the issue of the plagiarism. I would also say, like in terms of foreign politics, both with Libya and Syria, her hesitant style, not in a timely fashion, coming up with a convincing position, somehow alienating her allies. So she has like made severe mistakes. But again, the opposition cannot really take advantage of that. In a way, I would say, you know, this case has been made quite often that Merkel has changed CDU party politics up to a point where they're not recognizable anymore. For instance, with the mandatory military service, and obviously after Fukushima and the Energiewende in Germany. So what she's doing is really a style of politics that works according to polls. Yeah, it's not about political conviction. She's really very pragmatically following the polls. What promises to be a consensus in the German society, that's the position that Merkel will obviously take. One could say, let's say that's an Amazon.com style of politics. Yeah, it's a politics that's about charts. It's not, in my sense, it's not a democratic style of politics in the way that it triggers a discussion. She's not leading to controversial debates either in her own party. I mean, there has been a lot of complaints about the lack of discussion of like major shifts in positions with the CDU, and the same is the case for the German society and the German debate in general. So in that sense, I would say Merkel's post-ideological style is also a post-democratic style.
So Peter, I'd like to ask a follow-up question to that has to do with gender and whether you think that gender has a role in Merkel's success. And the backdrop for that question is partly, we recently hosted Hans-Ulrich Klose here in Pittsburgh. Uli Klose is the former Lord Mayor of Hamburg. He spent almost 40 years, about 40 years in the German Bundestag. He's a member of the Social Democratic Party. And I had an opportunity to speak with him when Merkel was first elected. And he said to me, we have to make sure she succeeds, even though she's not my party. And I said, why? And he said, if we don't work collectively to make sure that Merkel is a success, it will be a very long time before we have a woman chancellor again. So for him, gender plays a very important role. But what's your take on the gender issue?
Well, I agree and disagree with him because, as was already mentioned, we do have Hannelore Kraft, who is a very popular SPD Landesmutter in North Rhine-Westphalia. So, but my take on Merkel's gender, let me start this way. I really love the fact that Germany is represented by a woman. I think that's a great thing in terms of like symbolic politics, in terms of representation. Given Germany's history in the 20th century, I think it does really make a difference because we do know German racial military violence and aggression has been linked strongly to notions of masculinity, of the Freikorps, of Prussian masculinity, etc., etc. So for me, this is still a great achievement that Germany, and a reunified Germany, after all, is represented by a woman as a leader. I also do think this does play a role in European conflicts. I think, let's say just briefly, anti-German sentiments in Southern Europe, I think, would be much, much stronger if we wouldn't have a female leader. All right, so having said that, it is obviously the case that when women in conservative parties like the CDU have a career, and we had previous examples in the 80s and 90s, for instance, Rita Süssmuth and Kohl's administration, the way to go for them is obviously to repress gender. Yeah? To have a career as a woman in a conservative party means to repress gender, to downplay it. Because, and the counterexample would be obviously Claudia Roth, yeah, where it's, let's say, an experiment how femininity, political femininity, can be staged different as opposed to gender. Merkel is playing it down with her style, with her clothing, obviously, and the logic behind that is apparently that as a female, and you could say the same about gay men, about Guido Westerwelle, you're being perceived as a woman before you're being perceived as anything else. So you have to somehow compensate for that, and you have to prove with your style that you can inhabit a universalist position. Yeah. So you somehow have to work against the mark of gender in this case, which is to say, Merkel certainly performs a desexualized image of femininity in the political arena. We can also see this each time she goes to Bayreuth, for instance, and suddenly we see her in an evening gown, and everybody's surprised that our leader is actually a woman, right? So, anyways, play into how does that? Yeah, excuse me. How does that play into the question of popularity? You could say, I would still assume that femininity does represent a certain threat within the political arena. So what Merkel does, because you could say, if she's desexualized, what kind of a woman is she? What kind of femininity does she represent? And what she is of course, the Mutti, yeah, the mummy, which is one of the terms she's getting in headlines, not just nationally, but also internationally. I would say there's even a certain connotation of the socialist Mutti, but Patrick can probably say something more about that. And the Mutti is obviously, you can read this in many ways, it is somehow a little bit disrespectful in the sense that it claims intimacy. At the very same time, it is obviously a non-threatening position of authority. So I think that's the gendered position that she inhabits in the German public. She's the Mutti.
Myra, given your work on feminism and on Germany, is there anything that you'd like to add to what Peter just commented on?
Aggressively working the Mutti image, if that doesn't sound like a contradiction, or actually I hope it does sound like a contradiction.
Right.
That is to say, I think one of the things that the Mutti, the mommy kind of image brings forward is not just desexualization, but caring.
Right.
And I think a lot of the animus against the CDU is weakened by the idea that Merkel cares for Germany, that the ways in which in the US, for example, the Democrats are perceived as the, quote, more feminine party, not per se because of Hillary Clinton or any one individual woman, but because they are not seen as being anti-social welfare, not seen as a kind of pro-gun, pro-militarist kind of party. I think the same works in the other direction. Namely, with Merkel at the head of the CDU, they don't look as militarist or nationalist. They don't look as anti-social welfare. They don't look as uncaringly market-driven as they might look if Merkel were not a woman.
That's right.
And I think she uses that very strategically and in general very well. I don't think that she's entirely without gender identification or not governing as a woman. I think the changes that have come in terms of childcare systems, for example, I think several of the kind of openings to the left that she's made can also be explained by a gender politics that is also shaped by having grown up in the East. And that's a realistic kind of way in which she translates her perspective into what a modern conservative party should be. It should be a party about choices, but for women as well as for men. It should be a party that is internationally powerful, but not militaristic, and so on and so forth. And I do think that those are gendered politics and perceived as gendered politics. I just think Merkel's very smart about using them not in an individualizing way to draw attention to her gender, but to use her gender in ways that advance the perception of the party.
Can I just briefly respond to that?
Sure.
I just wanted to say I agree. I mean, certainly with the caring aspect, also with the gender politics, but it's certainly not feminist politics, what she is suggesting. We have
Never said it was.
What's that? Never said
I
it was.
didn't say it was.
I'm just an addition to that, right? Because we have the case of the Betreuungsgeld, the financial child support, which is very controversial. And we also have the question of the Frauenquote, where Ursula von der Leyen didn't get through with her suggestions.
So we're going to stay in Austin and go to Per Urlaub. He is assistant professor of German in the Department of German at UT Austin. And he's focused a lot of his research on language studies and has published mostly on the literary reading of material in second languages. And in our conversation, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and focus on education and education policy. And whether or not you think under a new government, however that government looks, but under Merkel's leadership, there will be any changes in the way in which schools and universities are structured?
Well, the short answer is no, and we actually even knew that before the elections, because in Germany, Germany has a federal ministry of education, but most of the policies that relate to how schools and how universities are run, or especially the teaching side of universities, are made on the level of the Bundesländer. So there will be no radical changes in education. The schools, secondary schools in Germany, will remain to be heavily biased in favor to children who grow up in monolingual German families, who have both parents at home. One of them can stay there for lunch and for the afternoon, because it's still not a standard in Germany that schools operate the whole day. So the school system is still a school system that's built upon the 1950s, 1960s notion about what a German family looks like. The other thing that's noteworthy about educational policy is really the increasing power of the Bundesländer, of the federal states. In the course of the Föderalismus reform, these were a new organization of the powers between the federal state and the powers of the individual states. The federal states even gained more and more power in terms of education. And on the other side, you have a rising influence of the European Union. The Council of Europe and the European Union are basically the driving force behind the so-called harmonization of the European transfer credit system. Everything is basically summarized under the label, the Bologna process. So you find something really interesting here, and I think it's symptomatic for a lot of other Politikfelder, for a lot of other areas of policy, that the federal government, which appears to most Germans as the most powerful entity, is not actually doing, is not really having that role. A lot of things that the Bundestag does is the implementation of regulations that come from Strasbourg or from Brussels, from the European Union or the Council of Europe. And on the other hand, the Bundesländer, the individual states, are getting more and more powerful. So in many ways, and educational policy is probably the most obvious field of policy that plays out. But you see that the federal government or federal policy is kind of squished in between the local, the level of the local jurisdictions and then the European jurisdiction. So in many ways, I'm most surprised if I come back to the election that Bundestagswahlen still have this great turnout. Because if you really think about where many decisions are made for Germans, they should be much more involved in European politics and much more involved on the local level, but the federal level gets most of the attention.
Well, and that's right. I mean, for Americans, it's important to remember that over 71% of the electorate voted in Germany in this last election, which is just staggering by American standards. One of the things that I've been following in the international press and in the German press since the election has been this notion that Merkel has been more focused on foreign policy than on domestic policy. And there have been some calls that, okay, you've won this third term, you need to focus on domestic issues like educational reform from kindergarten through university. And I guess what you're saying is, even if Merkel does focus on some of these domestic issues, it's going to be very hard for her to implement any sort of real changes.
Yeah, no, that's basically what I'm saying. That there are more and more areas where, in the past, or in previous decades, the federal government had more Richtlinien competence, more just like was giving direction in terms of where policy goes. Where this proactive role of the federal government is now more a reactive role. So, and I see that, and the larger concern that I see here is actually that the Germans seem to not be as interested in European and politics at the European level. I mean, very few Germans, if you would ask people just on the just randomly, could explain you how the mechanics of Brussels and of Strasbourg work. So, and there is a post-democratic, if I can borrow this term from Peter, there is a post-democratic quality of that if the electorate is not interested in a significant level of policy or policy making. There's a disjunct between policy decisions and the people.
Thank you. So let's now widen the aperture a little bit and go to David Crew. He's the distinguished teaching professor of history at the University of Texas in Austin. And as a historian, I guess my first question is there any historical significance to this election? And if so, what would that be?
Yeah, well, before I get to that question, I want to stay with Angela Merkel just one quick second. And, you know, this might even fit into a larger historical framework, but Angela Merkel has often in recent weeks and months been described as the most powerful political leader who's a woman in recent European history, right? And that means that she's obviously always compared to, guess who, the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. And there, the contrast works very well in her favor, right, of the caring Mutti. I don't think that many things would have been said about Margaret Thatcher, but the being a caring Mutti, that might have operated in her own family, but I don't think in Britain, in the UK, or in Europe as a whole. But I think there's two things I would say. Is one is that, I mean, I think it's hard to say how the reaction to what Germany is doing in terms of the European debt crisis would be even worse in Southern Europe if she weren't in office. But the fact that she is a caring Mutti at home does not necessarily translate into being that broad. I was appalled to see, for example, and this is not the only example of this, that on one Greek illustrated magazine, she was presented in an SS uniform. So seen in a very negative light. And then quickly, this does bring me into more of the historical framework. One thing I would say is that it's probably a good idea not to focus exclusively on personalities, because I think it's important, especially from an American vantage point, to recognize that the political rules and playing field and political culture are simply different in Germany, right? So if you look at the history of the Christian Democratic Union going back to the immediate post-Second World War period, you're talking about a party that's conservative, that definitely sees itself as an attempt to reassert Christian values, broadly speaking, against the background of what it perceives to be the catastrophe of Nazism in its terms brought on by de-Christianization. Now, that's certainly not what the CDU is all about anymore, but one thing that is a fundamental element of consensus, I think, in most German political parties, certainly the two major ones, is the social market economy. And that means market economy, but it also means a social welfare state, a network. The terms of that can be argued about, but it's very different than simply for and against Obamacare, for example, as is the framework in the United States. So I think it's also the party. It's not a surprise to me that she can inhabit this role, even though she's in this party, because she's in this party. Okay, so then the other sort of historical question that occurs to me, at least, is how much of a turning point is this? Attention's been drawn to the fact that the Free Democrats have disappeared from the national political scene, or at least don't have representation. I think it's important to sort of, first of all, emphasize how significant that seemingly small change is in terms of the longer-term history of the Federal Republic. This is a party, first of all, that has served longer years in government than either of the two main political parties. Why? Because it's been essential to forming coalitions, which then leads us into this question that coalitions have been the normal path in German history. There's only been very few times when any political party has gained an absolute majority. So it has been the kingmaker, and it's no longer there anymore. So does this mean a tectonic shift? And that leads us into this issue of coalitions that can be formed, that should be formed, what they're going to look like. It's important, again, in historical terms, to remember that if a grand coalition comes out of the current negotiations, that'll only be the third time in the history of the Federal Republic since 1949 that this has happened. So, one big question is, does the changes we see in this election, is that a tectonic shift where grand coalitions will become the new normal? And I, as a historian, I don't predict the future. We predict the past is what we do. But it seems to me that the options of grand coalitions need to be looked at from both sides. And this issue of left coalitions, which seems totally unrealistic at this point, mainly because I think it needs to be emphasized, so because of certain of the positions of Die Linke, especially on NATO. They want to pull out of NATO. Well, no one's having that, right? Those have got to change. But, respected political observers like Frank Deppendorf have suggested in a few years this may be possible, right? Right now, Per Steinbrück is on a talk show on election eve, said categorically there's no way that we will, it's just excluded, right, that we would form a coalition with Die Linke. But that could be a possibility in the future. I just want to, I don't want to take up much more time, but I do want to just sort of bring attention back to the other small party that, in my mind, has just come from nowhere, really. And that is the Alternative für Deutschland, all right, which, you know, it did much better than anyone anticipated. It didn't make it over the 5% hurdle, but it did much better. I think we have to be careful about how we characterize it. I think they want to be careful about how they are characterized. Seeing them as a right-wing populist party, that may explain part of the electorate, although I think only part of it. In Germany, it's been called the party of the professors, right? That these people are economics professors and others who have taken a position against Euro bailout and maybe in the long term against the Euro, not against the European Union. And it's important that, at least in one analysis I saw, that why the FDP lost in terms of where the votes went was, you know, almost 2 million went to the CDU, but a significant number of FDP voters turned to the Alternative für Deutschland. So that makes what it is complicated. I think it can't be readily analyzed in simply right-wing populist terms.
So, David, let me ask a follow-up question, particularly since you started by wanting to talk a little bit about Merkel. Given the fact that you're a historian and that you've studied German politics and certainly periods of history where political fragmentation really contributed to major changes in Germany and in the German political system, do you think that Merkel's popularity is masking or concealing political fragmentation?
Well, I mean, I think that for one thing, German politics before Hitler came to power and after were fragmented. They're just less fragmented now than they were in the Weimar Republic. And a lot of obviously everyone knows that a lot of the election, the constitutional framework within which elections take place was originally written with an eye to that fragmentation that people thought allowed Hitler to come into power. I don't know the specific answer to that, but it does seem to me that it's important that we keep an eye on those small parties and movements which are clearly expressing real grievance and discontent with certain aspects of the policies of the CDU and of the major political parties. And then I would add in the German political landscape has become much more fragmented since unification in 1990 than it was before that point in time. There are just many more players in the field at the moment. And we could go into some of the reasons for that, but that's just simply a fact of life.
Okay, thanks. So let me remind you that if you want to tweet a question, you can use hashtag PITTCOE to shoot the question this way. We've got about 20 minutes left for questions and conversation with our speakers. I have a whole bunch more questions, but I want to open it up to all of you who are participating. And I'd really kind of like to do it in round robin style to each of the video conference sites. But let's begin here in this room at the University of Pittsburgh and then close at least this round of questions at the overflow room. Does anybody here have a question for any of our speakers?
Yes, I do.
So go ahead, just speak up, introduce yourself, tell us who the question's directed to, and then go ahead.
Okay, I'm Katja Witzel. I'm visiting DAAD professor here at the History Department in Pittsburgh. And I would like, it's actually a general question to all of you. I would like to draw attention to the fact that the AfD actually also got votes from former voters of Die Linke. And I found this very interesting, and I actually couldn't explain that to myself, but maybe you have an idea.
Does anybody want to take that on?
I think it's a Protestpartei. So it's and after all, Die Linke was the only party represented in the former Bundestag that voted against some of the bailouts. So I think, but I think more on the psychological level, I see that as a typical target for Protestwähler.
Patrick, do you want to?
Sure, I'll weigh in a little bit on that. The FDP took a look at this analysis. The FDP lost voters to every other party, and to the biggest group they lost voters to was non-voters, bigger than the AFD. I don't have the figures for AFD there, but they lost 1.10 million voters to the left party. I mean, to go from a liberal party to the left party is just stunning. 880,000 to the Union, 870,000 to the Greens, and it just is rather stunning that this party was able to collect those kind of numbers. At the same time, there's also widespread skepticism about what this party could actually achieve. Infratest did a survey, an election day survey, in which they found that 54% of the voters said it's not a party to be taken seriously. 44% said they like the party because they can't solve the problems, but they can name them. And the name is Europe. As one of the other speakers pointed out, that this was, I think you said it was the party of professors and economists who were frustrated with the euro. 37% said it was an alternative for voters who might not otherwise vote, but I think that's probably the voting analysis showed that wasn't really the case. And 21% of voters actually said, I think it's good that a party speaks out against the euro. So I was thinking it might be interesting, not that the other parties should take an anti-euro stance. I don't think that's in the cards. But they might want to differentiate themselves a little bit more from one another in terms of support for the euro, or maybe it may be the way that they try to deal with austerity, for instance, as it's imposed on other countries.
So now let's go to Miami. Does anybody in Miami have a question for any of our speakers today?
Yes, there's a question here at Florida International. My name is Alex Thorlton. I did grow up in Germany. I came here to Miami, so this is a wonderful discussion room. Can you all hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. The question is about the FDP, and we know that in the last election they had 14%, and now we see them scattering in all different directions. I hear some went to the Linke, some went to the bigger and smaller parties. Do you think that is a problem more with personnel, or is it really an ideological shift?
I can.
Well, I'd like to try to. Yeah, go ahead.
Who do you want to answer?
You go ahead.
I mean, I can only go on the basis of what I've been reading in the media, but it seems that it was sort of all of the above. But more, internal conflicts, but also a sense that after the last election, they just didn't deliver on major promises, especially with regard to reducing taxes, and a feeling that they just didn't represent the people who had given them that 14% in the previous election. But others may have other thoughts.
Yes, I have another thing that I would like to throw in, and that is my impression that the 2009 results, both for the FDP and for the Green Party, were inflated due to the fact that they were two opposition parties being opposition against the CDU-SPD Grand Coalition. Mm-hmm. So the fact that, both the FDP and the Greens had double-digit results in 2009, I think is very much explainable out of that. So obviously the FDP really took a really nose-diving action here. But the Greens are also not doing very well. And I think that's very much back to the new normal. I mean, the FDP was many years a party where people were often not certain if they make the 5% hurdle or not. Mm-hmm. Now they didn't make it. I'm not one of those who thinks it's the end of this party. I think they won't be represented in the Bundestag, but they will have the bonus in 4 years or whenever the next elections will be, maybe earlier, that they can argue from the position of of a party that was not in power then. And I definitely see a potential of a comeback there. And with the Green Party, I don't understand or well, I wouldn't say I don't understand, but I think that what's going on in the last few days in the Green Party is a little bit over the top. Now everybody is. I think they have 8%. I think that's they expected much more. But I think that's where I see them more or less.
You could also say they've lost less than the FDP and the Linkspartei. Maybe another word on the Greens, which I think is interesting to me. In many ways, one could say the Greens are also the new FDP, right? So they completely took over the core competency for civil rights, which was one of the characteristics of at least the 70s FDP before we had the Green Party, and the FDP never got it back. We also have a certain similarity, even in demographics, if one thinks about the income of an above average income of the voters for the Green Party. So in many sense, the Greens also took over certain functions from the FDP, and it'll be interesting to see how much the Greens will be a potential future party in a coalition. To my knowledge, Horst Seehofer already categorically said no, there's not going to be a black-green coalition, and given his results from last week or 2 weeks ago in Bavaria, he has a very strong voice in the moment, so probably not, but potentially that would be an option, of course.
You want to add anything?
Just one thing about the overall party system. One interesting development is that if you look at the two-party share of the vote, that is the results that the Union and SPD together realized this time, they're starting to edge back up to the 70% mark. Now, it's been 60 years, well, it was 60 years between the 1953 election when the party system, when the Union and the SPD was able to gather in that many votes, and it wasn't until 2005 when they dropped below that 70% mark. Now, and the following election, 2009, they were below 60%, and now they've together, Union and SPD have climbed to 67%. So many political scientists who look at the party systems think that that's a significant change, or that might mark a significant change in direction and a return to a more stable party system. Although in each of these other elections going back until 49 or 53, rather, you had a strong or the FDP represented in Parliament. So sort of a mixed bag of results.
I know there's not a big crowd at UNC Chapel Hill, but if you'd like to ask a question, then please do.
Thank you. We don't have any questions.
Okay. How about at the University of Wisconsin? I know there are some students there as well. Any questions from any of you?
Doesn't seem to be the case.
Okay. And how about in the overflow room here at Pitt?
Department too. I was wondering whether the presenters could actually comment on the role of the CSU, because there's one thing that's remarkable about what happened after the elections in Bavaria. I mean, it might be great for, I mean, compared to the US, a turnout of 71% might sound great, since like historically in Germany, that's not a great turnout. But what happened after the election, all of a sudden, we had a spike in interest in the elections. And now that also translates into more power, I would say, for the CSU in the coalition debates. And that's also how it has been presented in Germany these past days. So I was wondering what the presenters were thinking about the role of the CSU in whatever kind of coalition is going to be formed.
Who would like to comment on that? I mean, David?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to butt in. But Peter already sort of alluded to one part of it. It puts them in a very strong position in the CDU-CSU fraction in the coalition, right? And one immediate outcome of that already is that, Seehofer is categorically clear that there'll be no alliance with the Greens, and I'm sure that that is going to be pushed through. So that's sort of, one alternative off the table. In terms of other things, I mean, I think that, I never understand this completely, but maybe I'm not taking it seriously enough. But a big issue in Bavaria is the whole campaign to require a Maut, which is a requirement that foreign trucks passing through Bavaria basically pay a road fee, right? But this isn't going to be required of Bavarian vehicles, right? Well, to begin with, this is like a non-starter because, as I understand it, it's illegal under EU requirements to have that kind of differentiation. But it's a big issue, and Merkel has said that it's a non-starter for them. So they're going to have to finesse this somehow.
And the CSU hasn't clarified whatsoever how they want to proceed, because they know as well that it is against EU law.
Yeah,
and they haven't given any explanation of how that's going to possibly work. Maybe I can just add one thing. Since Seehofer already excluded the possibility of a coalition with the Greens, I would say he's going to give Angela Merkel a pretty hard damn time. Also, when they're starting conversations with the SPD, at least in 2 points, which is Mindestlohn. There's going to be a problem also with Betreuungsgeld, because the SPD is absolutely against the childcare money, and Seehofer, I don't see him switching positions here. I'm not sure how this is going to work.
Because that's one of the few things where you have ideology going on.
Right.
This was like a very ideological, sterile election in general, because you have not these it was not like this big. And but this is the CSU is probably the fraction within the Union that still is anchored in ideology and not in pragmatism like Merkel is. So, and I think that there will be a loud voice from Munich in the coalition negotiations, but also beyond.
Well, and you could even perhaps go a step further and say some of the debates that we have between CSU and CDU are also taking place within CDU. And a lot of more conservative party members and people in the parliament are not so happy with Merkel's direction. So I can also see a strong Horst Seehofer getting quite a few allies within the CDU.
Yeah, from what I can see, that could be an interesting development to watch, because one of the criticisms within the party of Merkel is that she's taken the party too far to the left, that it's a social democratization of the CDU. And it remains to be seen what kinds of conflicts that produces. But I definitely agree that the CSU has a very strong hand to play. And the question of whether that could actually scuttle negotiations with the Social Democrats is an interesting one. I don't see what options the Social Democrats have that are good ones. I think that going into a coalition is not a good option, and staying outside, and then there would have to be new elections. That would be a bad option for them. They probably lose even more votes. So I think it's very, very messy at the moment. But what's clear, as Per said, is the voice from Munich will be strong in Berlin.
So I think we have time for one more question from Illinois. Go ahead.
Hi, could we talk some about the Eurozone crisis and what role that played in the elections, as the Merkel's party kind of downplayed the issue. So now that they Europe is still experiencing this crisis, could it play a role in future politics against Merkel and her party now that they have to deal with it, I guess?
So acoustically, I was having a hard time understanding it a little bit, but if I can summarize the question, I think it went in the direction of now that Merkel has won the election, what role will the Euro crisis play in her politics? Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Okay. It's unfortunate that Nils Ringe has left, because that was actually one of the questions that I was hoping to ask him before the end of the conversation today. From any of the rest of you, any thoughts on whether there will be a change in Germany's behavior or position on the Euro crisis now that Merkel has won this third term?
Yeah, I don't know. I'll
Please,
stab
Pat.
with that. I don't expect to see a change in her position. I think that one of the strengths that she has at home is that the German public has given her a lot of credit for her handling of the euro crisis. In some ways, I mean, she's pursued policies that I personally wouldn't have pursued, but that's probably why I'm not chancellor. But I think that she has, and following up on some of the comments about the sort of the moody nature of her character, she does very well exploit that and demonstrate that she's, she can be tough with the Greeks, with the Spaniards. She can also look out for German economic interests. And I think that's the main reason why she's seen so popular, seen so positively by the German voters. And some of the was also struck also by some of the exit polling that gave her 84% overall. 84% of the voters said, well, I think she represents Germany quite well, but that included, 75% of SPD voters and 69% of Green voters. People didn't even vote for her, and they still hold her in very high esteem. So I think that that will give her no reason to change her policy on Euro.
So it's time to wrap up. People have often said to me that they think German politics are boring. And I have to admit that I'm always sort of struck by that, because I happen to think that German politics are really, really interesting. And I think we've really been able to get at some of the interesting facets about Germany's political system, but also German politics today. And I'd really like to thank all of our panelists today. Great insights from all of you. Germany is definitely still worth watching. And I'd like to thank everybody for participating, for good questions. And also many thanks to the EU Center here for inviting me to moderate this discussion. It's been a lot of fun. So thanks to everybody. It's been great.
Thank you.